Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Burt.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week we'll be joined by Mary Rose Gunn, Chief Executive of the Fore, to talk about funding for small charities.
But first, we are so happy to have one of our columnists on the line. Yes, we're joined now by Debra Allcock Tyler, who is the Chief Executive of the Directory of Social Change. Hi, Debra.
Hello, nice to see you both.
It's great to have you on. So you wrote a column for us week before last all about corporate chairs, and you were posing the question, are they a blessing or are they a curse? It's a great piece for anybody who hasn't read it yet. I recommend that you do. But you kind of outlined the tensions between having people moving from the corporate world into charity governance. So, Debs, could you tell us what, in your view, are some of those recurring pitfalls of having a corporate chair who then moves onto a charity board?
Yeah, I mean, it's not to say that they're all disastrous, because they're not. There's some really good ones. But there are some differences between chairing in the private sector and chairing in the voluntary sector. Although obviously managing people and general governance, there's lots of similarities. In the voluntary sector, there are different kinds of pressures. So, for example, in the voluntary sector, the chair typically doesn't have any additional powers or authority in law than any other member of the trustee board, which isn't always the case in a private sector company, where they very often do have authority and decision-making powers. And that means that in the voluntary sector, governance can be a lot tougher, because you've got to engage the whole board, you've got to keep them all involved, you've got to make sure that they know what's going on and what decisions are being made. And it can cause real problems when chairs are parachuted in effectively from a corporate and then behave as they would do in their own private sector organisations. And that can often cause enormous problems and tensions, and particularly not just for the board as a whole, but also for the executive team, who, have to balance and manage the information they're giving and the decisions that are being made with this particular behaviour. In fact, I remember, this was several years ago now, a chap who came from the private sector into the voluntary sector and came to see me to sort of talk about the transition. He was saying, I've been really looking forward to coming into this sector because I feel, I've got a lot to offer and it feels like it's going to be an easier experience and a bit more fun and all the rest of it. And I'm looking at him and thinking, oh dear. And then 6 months later, he's back banging on my door saying, let me in. I had no idea how tough this was. And I think there's often a misperception. And I think finally the thing I'd say is that in the private sector, the thing you have to do is relatively straightforward. Your job is to keep the business profitable, obviously keep your employees happy, etc., but in order to maximise value to your shareholders. So the number of stakeholders you have to manage are not quite as complex as they are in the charity sector, where you've got to manage donors and funders and volunteers and other trustees and the media, because we have a level of scrutiny that they simply don't in the private sector. And that's often where the pitfalls occur.
So what would your advice be for charities to get the most out of their corporate chair?
Well, I think it starts at recruitment, actually. I'm not saying don't recruit a corporate chair, but I'm saying very often we assume that they understand that charity governance is different, and they often don't. And so we don't, for example, in interview questions, ask them, do you understand the difference between charity governance? Do you understand what the obligations are on you? Do you understand the complexities you're going to face? We also don't induct them very well. So we'll induct them into the work of a charity. We don't actually talk to them about what does being a chair of a charity mean and what's charity law. And you'd be amazed how many, although you probably wouldn't, have never even heard of the governance code, for example, which is becoming increasingly important in terms of how you run organisations. So, if you can get off to a good start, that helps. But if you've already got one, I think it comes back to going back to saying, right, let's have a look at the role of a chair in a charity. I would obviously buy my book. I don't get any money from it, so I'm never embarrassed about promoting it. But talking to them about what the differences are, I think having those conversations really, and definitely having a board review, having a conversation, creating it about what's the best way to operate in this charity, what's the best way of us governing the charity.
Absolutely. And I think it's always worth reiterating again what you said about how the responsibilities of charity trustees in particular can be so heavy compared to those responsibilities in the corporate space. And it always bears reminding, I think, of saying that ultimately the legal responsibilities for your organisation do fall on the trustees. And we have seen some really big cases in recent years where trustees have been held accountable for, the actions of a charity. And so making sure that everyone is coming into that with their eyes open is very important.
Yes, it is. And I think, to be fair, I don't think it's just people who come from corporate backgrounds who forget or don't always understand about the role of charity. I just think that, I would start with the executive team and say, come on, this is your job, is to guide and advise your board to make sure they understand. So I do think that we have a duty as chief execs and executive teams and charities to make sure that we're giving the information. And I think that often the chief exec is seen as like a subordinate of the charity, when in reality, actually, they're the professional advisor to the board. They're the person who has to give the board information, who has to give them advice, but also has to keep them updated with changes in governance and things like that. So I think that chief execs don't have to be victims of poor governance. They can be architects of better governance by making sure that they are giving the right information, that they're positioning themselves in that sense. And also there's also a myth that the chair is the boss of the chief executive. Actually, they're not. The chief executive reports to the entire board. The chair is simply delegated to manage that relationship. And it's not uncommon in charities, actually, for the chair role to be sort of split. So there's somebody who's like the personal support and guider, so on, to the chief executive, where somebody else is sort of managing the meetings and the agendas and the more sort of technical stuff. So it doesn't all have to be on one person. And actually, finally on that, and also boards themselves are often at fault. They just, let the chair sometimes run rampant. And I'm never entirely sure why, whether it's they feel they can't challenge, they can't stand up, or they themselves think of the chair as the boss, which is a very, very dangerous way to run a charity.
Brilliant. So much there in the space of just a few minutes, but Debs, it's been a pleasure to have you on as always.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you both. It really is. And the podcast is great. So thank you for allowing me to be part of it.
Moving on to this week's main feature. We're here to talk about the funding environment for small charities and how the landscape of philanthropy could be adjusted to better support them. We're delighted to be joined in the studio by Mary Rose Gunn, the founder and chief executive of the Fore, an organisation set up in 2017 that sources funding and skills development to support promising small charities and social enterprises. Hi, Mary Rose.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. And just to start, I'd like to set the scene for the discussion we're about to have by playing a clip from an interview that we recently recorded with a small charity chief executive. So we're going to hear from Jane Evans, who's the chief executive of West Norfolk Carers in Kings Lynn. And we're going to listen to a couple of minutes from that interview in which she explains how the funding situation has changed since she joined the charity in 2004.
When I first started working at West Norfolk Carers, the funding came from a single service level agreement with the local authority and another much smaller one with health. Over the years, those SLAs have been eroded and devalued, and reliance on grants, on charitable giving, and that sort of thing has increased. It's not, in the great scheme of things, an expensive charity to run. It costs about £260,000 a year. So on that, you can see that not huge amounts of money are being spent on salaries. What we want to do is divert the funding to where it's needed, at the front line, where people need the support. And we've been very successful in achieving that until recently, when circumstances have changed. I have been working so hard completing funding applications and grant applications, and whereas at one time I could have completed an application with relative confidence that it would be successful, that definitely hasn't been the case. And I've seen so many funding applications declined and feedback from the different agencies saying there was nothing wrong with your application, we just had too many applicants and we haven't got enough funding to meet the need, the demand. We as a charity also saw a decline in donations, charitable giving direct to us, so we were really caught up in a perfect storm and there was no way out of it. And I think when our last funding application was declined, which would have been in about November, our finance officers said we actually cannot go beyond March now. So it was a continual looking for funding, working with the team and actually talking about if we don't get money by December, we close.
To briefly summarise what happened next at West Norfolk Carers, the charity did announce in January that they would have to close. They vacated their offices just before Easter, but this month they received the news that they could stay open, albeit in a modified form, thanks to a partnership with the NHS. And you can hear more about the story of Jane Evans and West Norfolk Carers in the final episode of our podcast documentary, The End of Charity. But coming back to the discussion today, Mary Rose, listening to that, is that the reality for many of the small charities that you're in contact with at the Fore?
I think that is a reality for huge numbers of charities across the UK, particularly obviously small ones. The funding landscape is really, really tough. It is incredibly competitive and has got so much more competitive since the pandemic. And they are really struggling to survive. Burnout rates in charity chief executives or leaders of small charities are extremely high. And it's really, really difficult. The charities that we are backing are, I think, most of them probably in a slightly different situation, in that the ones that we are specifically looking for are ones who are doing things that are a bit different, who are coming up with new and innovative ways of solving problems, and therefore our research and all of the conversations we have with them are showing again and again that they're proving remarkably resilient. When we are looking for the charities that we are keen to place our support behind, we are specifically looking for leadership that is very creative, very adaptable, very flexible, and they are proving themselves to be that, often against extraordinarily difficult odds, as that clip showed. So the ones that we're backing are still doing it really very well, but we are really worried about them. We're worried about how much pressure the current funding environment places on the leadership to just have responsibility for everything. You know, they are lying awake at night, not sure where the next pound is going to come from. And you can be as creative and as clever and as innovative as you like in terms of how you're going to raise money. But fundamentally, when it's really difficult, you are going to be spread very thinly, and that takes a toll. So one of the things that we're really trying to ramp up from our side is the peer-to-peer support networks that we run to help charity leaders feel less lonely, and also to share all of their experiences and the things that they've done wrong that haven't worked, so their fellows don't go down the same rabbit holes, and share the things that they have found have worked really well, so that their fellow social entrepreneurs can also take advantage of that knowledge. And we're also as well ramping up access to skills support from individuals outside of the sector. So our connections, we're really working hard to build our pro bono networks so that when you've got leaders that need skills, they've got easy access to finding those skills, which can be hugely valuable. I mean, even if it can be a mentor or it can be something really specific, you know, if you've got a bit of money to employ a marketing person, but you're a small charity leader who has set up your charity because you're an expert in healthcare in the community, you don't really know what a good marketing person looks like compared to a bad marketing person. So having somebody who's a marketing expert help you with interviews or even just help you write the job description can make a huge difference and help reduce the strain in a small way. I mean, nothing is going to solve the funding problem, but if we can reduce the strain in other areas, then hopefully it means that the leaders have got more energy to spend on doing the thing that is hardest at the moment, which is raising support.
And we know that this is a very, very difficult funding environment for charities of all sizes. I don't really know any organisation that is genuinely not concerned about where their cash is coming from at present in the cost of living crisis. But as an organisation that really specifically makes a choice to focus on those small organisations, what would you say is unique about funding these small grassroots groups?
I love this question. And I think my short answer would be that in funding small charities, you have a unique opportunity to have truly catalytic impact, in that you can be there to support an organisation at a pivot point. And if you are there and you're there at the right time and you're there with particularly unrestricted funding and a plethora of different skills and peer-to-peer support options, which is what we do, you can see some truly exciting things happen and change, not just at a community level, but have the potential for systems change on a national level. And we've got a lot of examples of where we have managed to be there at that point. And if they have made it, and a lot of them do, because social entrepreneurs, and we call our charity leaders social entrepreneurs because they are incredibly entrepreneurial, but social entrepreneurs don't give up. They do what they're doing because they really believe in it, and they are extraordinarily safe people to back because they will give up everything to achieve their mission. So, if you just put a bit of support behind them, it's amazing what they can do with it.
Yes, I agree. I think there is an extraordinary resilience in this space. And certainly I remember reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic, which was the first in many of the kind of rolling state of permacrisis that we're currently experiencing in the sector right now. But when COVID-19 hit, what I remember being really interesting was that the charities that were falling into dire straits fast were the much larger ones. And smaller organisations were much more resilient because they were used to being agile. They were used to being incredibly responsive in the ways that they operated. And I agree with you, just giving them the support to do that, it's amazing what they can achieve. I also love the phrase unrestricted funding, which I heard there, which is a very important one.
I can sense your enthusiasm for these entrepreneurs, charitable or business or whatever they are that you are supporting. And I was wondering, firstly, how much demand is there for the funding that you are facilitating and you are offering at the Fore? And kind of linked to that, what is the philanthropy environment like for these types of organisations?
The demand is off the charts. We are still, I think, one of a very few number of organisations that give unrestricted funding with a development mindset. I would say we're offering the grants as it's not business as usual. It is about helping small charities become more resilient, more sustainable, have more impact, or to scale. We are, I think, still really unusual in doing it in that way. And consequently, we have so much. There's probably, we could very, very easily give with almost no effort 3 times the number of grants that we're able to give at the moment. And the demand also for the wraparound support that we offer is huge. I think the question about the landscape and the funding landscape is actually more positive than you might expect. There was actually, to slightly disagree with one of the points that you just made about the larger charities also struggling in the funding environment, there was actually a report that said that the amount of money that is going to larger charities has gone up, which I was amazed by, despite everything going on. So I think, obviously it's always difficult, but I think actually they're in a better situation than we thought they were, which was really pleasing. But the amount of money, particularly, or this is in relation to the increased costs, the amount of money going to charities under £500,000, their funding has gone up by something like 3 percentage points, but their costs have gone up by something like 11 percentage points. So it's immensely difficult for them. And that gets even worse for the charities that we term as micro, which is turnover of under 100 grand. And in terms of equity and getting money into communities that are really facing the worst kinds of deprivation and the worst challenges, those charities that work in those communities are generally really, really small. So that means that as a sector, the ones who need the support most are struggling the most. I think some people realise what we are seeing is that post-pandemic, there has been a definite increase in interest and in availability of support for smaller organisations, in that I think the new generation of philanthropists so this is not the traditional trust and foundation sector. This is people who have generally made their own resources. So it's entrepreneurs, it's investors who've done really well. They are really keen to give back. I think they were, as a kind of cohort, extremely aware of how much as a society we owe to all of the people who were the key workers, the people who were working in the healthcare system, the people who were keeping the country going during the pandemic, who disproportionately paid in terms of health and from a financial perspective for the effects of the pandemic, and that they are really now very aware of the fact that they are in an incredibly fortunate situation. They were able to save money often during the pandemic, and they are really keen to give back. And when they want to give back, they don't want to give to the larger organisations where it can feel like a drop in the ocean. The support that they're able to give, they are really interested in supporting these smaller new ideas, community solutions. They don't necessarily need to be new ideas, but these kind of really cost-effective philanthropic activities. And they are excited by taking a bit of risk as well, which for the charity sector is really pretty groundbreaking, because generally people don't like taking risk when they're backing charities. So I think that there is something really positive that is out there, and as a sector we just need to do our best to try and harness that in the right ways and make sure that what doesn't happen is we end up with a whole nother slew of trusts and foundations that are set up with individual application processes that small charities find it really hard to navigate because they just don't have the time to make multiple applications to multiple people. And it's something where we at the Fore are really hoping to be able to help the sector by being a kind of single point of contact for charities, in that once they have applied and got into the system, we are then able to introduce them to a wide range of support.
And what do you think needs to change in order to stimulate longer term funding options from philanthropic donors?
I think that a lot of donors are really open to the idea, and particularly the more they learn about the sector, the more they realise that this is, of course, it's what people need. But I think it's about building trust between the sector and between the supporters, because if you have trust, then things just work so much better. But the problem with building trust is it takes time, and often donors don't have that much time, and charities also don't have that much time. So you're working in a situation where it's time is very much in short supply. But I think there's also a piece around the confidence of charities in feeling like they can ask for multi-year support. So much of the way that the trust and foundation funding system has been set up hasn't really encouraged them to feel like they're trusted by funders. And when you feel like you're not trusted, you end up acting in a certain way, and you don't feel like you can admit to things going wrong because you think, well, that'll mean they'll never want to back me. Whereas actually, I think a new generation of donors and the trust and foundation sector are definitely listening and much more open to these sorts of conversations than I think they probably were 10 years ago. But encouraging small charities to say, look, you could give me money for a year and I'll be able to do this, and that would be fantastic. But if I knew it was coming for 3, then I'll be able to employ a much better member of staff, because I'll be able to guarantee then that the money is there for a longer term contract. I'll be able to think about my budgeting in a much more holistic way. We'll be able to plan strategically. We'll be able to work towards offering something that has the potential to mean that we might be able to access some kind of statutory funding, local authority support, government support, working with the NHS in some way in the longer term. So when all of that is shared with a donor was like, well, of course. And, let's agree what you're going to achieve. And obviously we'll review it on a year-on-year basis. But of course you need 3 years worth of support from me. But the charity needs to have the opportunity to have that kind of conversation with a donor. And you can't do that through a form.
And we hear so much about how difficult it is for organisations, especially organisations, to do that long-term planning, which you say is so vital. And that is because for so many well-established trusts and foundations, funding is ultimately project focused, it's restricted, and it has a time cap. So how can you plan for that employee that you need to take your organisation for the next level when you know you only have funding that will carry you through to the end of this financial year? Why is it, do you think, that so many trusts and foundations are still operating on this model of restricted funding? And why do we need to see a shift in this area towards that unrestricted funding model? I feel like you've touched on it a lot anyway, but just to kind of press the point a bit further.
This is the $1 million question. Why do more trusts and foundations not do more unrestricted funding? I think there are a number of reasons. Trusts and foundations traditionally don't think that they should spend money on due diligence. And I think this is a fundamental shift that needs to happen, is that they think, and you can understand why they've got to this point, it's much better for us to just give all of the money away rather than spend money on our resource to do the due diligence. But the thing is that if you don't spend money as a trust and foundation on due diligence, you basically just put all of the burden onto the shoulders of the charities to spend hours filling in the forms. And there's been a huge pressure on trusts and foundations to show their impact and to narrow their focus and to say, oh, look, this is what we're achieving. But actually, in a lot of instances, what that has meant is that it's actually just, they've tightened up their criteria, which has made it harder for charities to access their money, and it takes them longer to try and explain to a trust and foundation why they meet the specific aims of that trust and foundation. And the specific aims of that trust and foundation have often been set by a trustee body who aren't necessarily that in touch with the actual needs on the ground. So, the trustee bodies, understandably, because they are very busy people with lives working in completely different sectors, but they may say, right, we keep hearing that mental health is a massive issue at the moment. We should focus on mental health. And clearly mental health is a huge issue at the moment, but actually the needs on the ground in the community may not be around mental health. It may be around the fact that there's huge cost of living crisis going on and people can't afford food for their children on a minimum wage job. So what is needed in terms of support is a much more holistic package in that community than just mental health. But the charities, when they're applying for funding, see that X foundation has made mental health their criteria, and they're, help, we have to show that we're all about mental health and we're not really doing much around supporting the families around, food poverty, because it's all about mental health. And what you end up with is trust and foundations driving mission creep, I would argue, because they are wanting small charities to say, our mission meets your mission perfectly. But obviously small charities are applying to, 20 different funders, and there's no way that their mission can meet the missions perfectly of 20 different funders. So I think that that's a real issue, and it's one of the big things that drives the lack of unrestricted funding, is because when you are, as a foundation, trying to measure the impact of your money on a specific issue, you want to support projects that are really addressing only that issue, rather than the holistic work of an organisation. So, and particularly, I think, with small charities, there are so many of them. And as a donor, it's very difficult to know which is a good small charity over which is a not so good small charity. So it's much easier to offer project funding that meets your specific criteria or your aims that you've set than it is to say, right, we're going to spend time getting to know this organisation and working out whether it's efficient and it's effective and it's doing what it says on the tin. And traditionally also small charities haven't necessarily, they've improved so much, but they haven't necessarily been that great about measuring impact and showing the difference they're making. And, quite rightly, foundations and trusts are wanting to make sure that they're giving money in a way that is going to make a difference. And, the imperfect solution that has ended up happening is this system with project funding and specific criteria, which actually doesn't really work for anybody, really, I would argue. So I think what we are trying to do to try and counteract this is show that you can, if you put a bit more resource into the due diligence process, you can offer unrestricted funding in a way that is really valuable for the charities and also has this potentially catalytic impact for the donors. So if you can get it right, it works for everybody. And it's really, really exciting.
So just as a final point, you are at the intersection between the funders and the charities who are desperately trying to get funding. I just wondered if you had any quick top tips for charities in the funding application process. How can they better articulate their impact, for example, or just any other tips that you have?
I think that one thing that we often see that's really easy to solve is people spend an enormous amount of time in funding applications talking about need. And I think that that's something that funders generally across the board, they generally understand. So don't waste too much of your space on talking about the need. Don't use jargon. I would say most people, particularly in trusts and foundations, they don't have very many staff, as we talked about. They don't have much capacity to spend time on it. They won't probably be experts. Ask a 10-year-old to read it. And if a 10-year-old doesn't understand what you're talking about, make it clearer, because what you're doing is really important and it's really making a difference in people's lives. And that should be really clear. So make sure it's very clear. I think use the space that you freed up by not talking too much about the need. Use one statistic saying this is an area of very high deprivation, one of the top 10 in the country, and then use the rest of the space that you've saved by not going into huge amounts of detail on that to show why you are the best people for the job. So is it that you really understand your community because you've grown up there, you've experienced some of the problems that you're helping people solve? Or is it that, you have run a similar organization in a different place and you've realized that in this new community there's a massive need for it? But really make it clear why you are the best people for the job and articulate the difference you're making, the impact. And I think there's a huge challenge around the fact that small charities can sometimes feel a bit scared about this impact management, impact measurement term, but that actually it doesn't need to be complicated. If you're really small and you've only got anecdotal evidence, that's absolutely fine, but just make sure that you've got the anecdote, say how many people you're working with and give some quotes from 5 or 6 of them saying this is the difference we're making on them. Say how many people come back to use your services. That's a fantastic definition of what you're doing is working, is if people come back and you have continued use. But really make sure that you make it clear that what you're doing is making a difference rather than you're just delivering stuff. We're delivering it because it works. And I think also have the confidence not to apply for funds that you think is going to take you an enormous amount of time, and actually the amount of money they're offering is not very large. So have the confidence to be a bit more selective about who you apply to. It's really difficult to take that decision, but you're winning when you decide actually that's not the best use of your time.
So many great pointers there. Mary Rose Gunn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Mary Rose, and that's it for this week. If you've enjoyed this episode and the Third Sector podcast in general and would like to support us, I'd like to provide you with a few ideas of how to do so. Firstly, please follow us on the podcast platform you use. Secondly, leaving a positive rating would also really help us. And if you'd like to go the extra mile, you can also leave us a review.
Thank you so much to today's guests, Mary Rose Gunn and Debra Allcock Tyler, to our producer, Nav Powell, and to you for listening.